Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. Today is a fun day of little snare drum hacks. Little things, maintenance-y kind of things, but also some playing, important texture, tone, a lot of stuff. Today we're going to touch on a few things that we've been talking about here lately that are both about playing and sound and also about maintenance things that are going to make sure you're not damaging any parts of the drum, everything's functioning its best, and make the whole process as easy as possible. Number one, up top. This is a big one for me because in the gigs that I do, I play a lot of brushes, I play a lot of mallets, different things, and I'm pretty much 100% of the time using coated snare batters, whether it's a UV1 or a G12, some kind of coated thing, because I need that texture to get the sounds out that I have to do. This brings us to the fact that I generally prefer the sound of a head that's been played for a little while, texture-wise, for brushes and different things. That fresh coating can sometimes be too much, not just from a sound perspective, but also just physically on the head. There's a lot of resistance. Sometimes you can catch the tips of the brushes in the coating, that kind of thing. Jazz players out there, or guys that play a lot of brushes, you may have done this before, seen this before. We're talking about sanding the coating off of a coated head, or maybe not off, but modifying the intensity of the coating on the head. Today we're going to use a UV1 batter. It's a pretty abrasive coating. To my ears, it's probably the most abrasive in the Evans line of batters you can buy for a snare drum. But on the flip side, it's super durable, and I like the sound of the coating, but like a little ways into having played the head for a while. So we're going to hear it fresh out of the box, and then we're going to take some of it off. Today, we're just going to use 400 grit sandpaper and basically just rub it around in concentric circles, stop, check it out, touch it, fingers, to see how it feels. Try to stay away from the hoops if you're going to do this, because you can for sure scratch your hoops up. You can do this with the head off of the drum, but you're not going to be able to test it if it's not at tension, so we tend to do it on the drum. All right, here we go. Now, what you're hearing here is actually just the close mic. The reason why we're doing this is because a lot of the subtleties of the sound get lost in the further mics, but this also isn't necessarily about the sound. A lot of this is about just the tactile sensation of pushing brushes around on the snare. If you've ever played a brand new head on a gig when you just took off your old one, it might feel like digging into dirt or something like that. It can be pretty rough. But there is a sound difference in the closer mics that is worth noting. Now, if that's not enough, we can sand it some more. There's there's a fair amount of this stuff on there. So another round of sanding, and then we're going to hear how that sounds. At this point, if I rub my fingertips on the head, I'm not really feeling any coating at all. There's a texture there, but it doesn't have any kind of grit to it anymore. So there's a lot of levels, that you could go through with this. And depending on what kind of head you're using, even within a particular brand, the coatings do vary. More sanding, less sanding. You do have to experiment a little bit. Less is more for starters. Make sure you don't take off too much. But this is changing the behavior of the head overall, in addition to just making it feel different. Now, let's leap the other way. What if you want just a tiny, tiny bit of texture, almost none? Well, then we're going to go and get a clear G1, and we're going to sand that to add some texture to it. If you've ever seen a suede head or anything that is etched, anything that's got kind of like a texture on it, but it's not a coating, this is more or less what's gone on there. There's been a texture applied to it with some kind of buffing or sanding or something like that. And just to be clear, those heads are not coated, whether you're talking about, the idea here is we're still changing the behavior of the head without adding any mass to it. When playing it with sticks, this also has a similar effect to using an etched head, which is that the highs are kind of chilled out. It doesn't have that characteristic clear snare batter thing that most of us don't care for. We've done videos about that recently. You can check those out. There's overtone stuff going on in that kind of scenario that's really not for everything. And this is kind of a cool middle-of-the-road thing that also adds just a little bit of texture to it if you're going to have to play brushes for like one tune, but otherwise you like this kind of thing. Now let's line them up back to back from grittiest to the very, very least. Now after that broad spectrum thing on the batter, we're going to flip over and just do one thing to the snare side head. What we're doing here is we're taking a drum that has a really, really deep snare bed. This is an old Ludwig Pioneer. It's deep, it's narrow, and we're going to tension the head up like you normally would, and then take out the wrinkles at the beds with a hairdryer. The essential concept here is that we're going to heat, not superheat, but we're going to heat up this area right around there with the head at tension, and everything's going to pull away, and it's going to get just soft enough to kind of get tucked into that snare bed and not melted, but kind of melted into the snare bed a little bit. And this keeps us from having to over tighten that spot to get the wrinkles out for a clean lay for the wires, and then end up basically having a super boxy sounding drum, which is what can happen with drums of this nature. Not all hair dryers are created equal. Not all pieces of Mylar are created equal. So there isn't a prescription for this. Again, same with the sanding, less is more. I set my cheapo hair dryer to high fan, high heat. If you have a really aggressive hair dryer, you can damage things. So you do have to be careful with this. But the bottom line here is that when I got things to the tension that felt right to me in terms of tuning, and it felt like the head and the hoop were level to me, I looked at the wrinkles in the snare bed with a light coming across it so I could actually see how sort of like crooked and canted it was. And I held the hair dryer over it for between 30 seconds and a minute, and I watched those things just disappear. It just, they were there and then they were gone. As soon as they were gone, I stopped. I didn't want to overdo it. And then once the wrinkles were basically not visible anymore, to counter a little bit of loss of tension from what we had just done, I just gave like a quarter turn to those two lugs on either side of the beds. And now we have a totally smooth, totally lovely looking contour into the snare bed that it's really saving us from having to crank up that spot to get rid of those wrinkles. And the drum sounds completely different. It's got a new lease on life, even though the batter head that's on here has been on multiple drums for a long time and seen a lot of action. On to issue number 3. This is a really invisible issue, but it was something that was costing me a lot of money in Snare Side heads for a while before I realized what was going on, what was wrong. And it is that the wires at the ends of your snare wires, where they're attached to the plates on the ends, can actually sometimes poke through the solder where they're attached to the plates and create little sharp pokey things that every time you turn your wires on and off are slowly cutting a hole in your snare side head right at the edge, and then one day you hit it and it just opens up like curtains and you go, how did I break my snare side head? Why does this keep happening? Basically, this can happen with any brand, any size, whatever. But what we're talking about now is what to do about it, and it's as simple as getting into finding the spots that are sharp on the underside. Again, this is the side that's touching the snare side head, and getting in there with just like a little hand file, like a narrow little hand file, flat one, and just sanding or filing or whatever you want to call it down those little sharp things so you don't have essentially needles going through your snare side head and basically destroying the integrity of it. The filing that I'm doing here is not really to remove a ton of metal from the ends of where the wires are poking at. It's just to soften it so that it's not sharp on the ends, because when you cut wires, you inevitably end up with sharp ends, and most of them are buried in the solder. But if you have some sticking out, you can just do a little bit of filing. If there's a lot sticking out, you could, nip it off with wire cutters or something like that. But we're basically just trying to soften the area, pillow it up a little bit, so that every time they're pressed again and then off of the bottom head, they're not digging holes. All right, that about wraps it up. Hopefully these are interesting things to you as they were to us, that you can employ to make sure that you're not having to replace parts super often and that you're getting the textures and tones out of the drum that you want. It's all about versatility. It's about making sure that things are functioning and doing exactly what you need, especially with the hairdryer thing. Like my Noble and Cooley could use it. Anything you have that has a really deep, especially narrow snare bed, vintage snares are rife with those things. And lastly, every drum that you get, these are things you can look at and understand if a drum has a kind of prescription for making it behave its best, whether it's the head choices all the way down to wire choices, and then things like this where it's more of a maintenance issue to make sure that every time a new drum crosses your path, these little things can just be kind of dialed in and make sure that they're doing exactly what you want. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell below so you hear about all of our new videos. Just like this one, we have tutorials still coming out every Tuesday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, along with loads of stuff on the Patreon, product stuff, snare spotlights, all sorts of things. Not to mention our exclusive cymbal series over on the Patreon that if you're not a patron already, you can follow the links below to check it out, see if you want to get involved, help support everything going on here. This is a patron-supported episode, as are most of them, and we could not be happier. The community over there is building in beautiful ways. We have great conversations, lots of exclusive content. I mean, what more can you say? Well, one more that you can say is I am super curious, particularly if you do employ any of the things that we did today and how you ended up doing that. But yeah, I'm curious about your stories about little mods you do to your snare drum to make sure that you can do your gig.